She was sitting on my sofa when I walked in, not perched at the edge the way a guest would. Settled. Legs tucked under her box braids spilling over the armrest I had reupholstered in November remote control, in her hand shoes, her shoes on my coffee table. The house smelled like her perfume. Something synthetic and sweet that had no business being in a home I'd spent 11 years making mine. Derek was in the kitchen. I could hear him opening the refrigerator like it was any other evening. I stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds. I counted. Then I set my bag down on the console table the same way I always did. Walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water. And I looked at my husband across the counter, and I thought, he has no idea what he just started. That was a Tuesday. By Friday, she had nowhere to go. And neither did he. Stay right here, because what happened between Tuesday and Friday is the part nobody sees coming. Drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's watching this with me right now. I grew up in Savannah, in a house where the windows stuck in summer and the electricity went out twice a year, whether we paid the bill or not. My mother worked nights at a laundry facility off Gwinnett Street and came home smelling like industrial detergent and exhaustion. She never complained. That was the thing about her. She never once sat down and said, "This is hard." She just kept moving, kept her chin level, kept the lights on when she could, and lit candles when she couldn't. She used to say the woman who controls the paper controls the room. I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was 26 years old, sitting in my first real estate law seminar at Emory, watching a professor walk through a case where a widow lost her home of 31 years because her name was never on the deed. Her husband had handled everything. She trusted that. The house went to his adult children from a previous marriage, and she was given 60 days to vacate. I wrote 3 words in the margin of my notes that day: never again, ever. I met Derek the following year at a fundraiser for a nonprofit that renovated affordable housing units in Vine City. He was in finance, already making good money, the kind of man who knew how to work a room without seeming like he was working it. He laughed easily. He remembered details: the name of your dog, the city your mother grew up in, the thing you mentioned once in passing that you didn't think anyone registered. We dated for 2 years. Got engaged in New Orleans on a trip I thought was just a birthday weekend. Got married in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Dahlonega with 43 people and a string quartet Derek had hired as a surprise. I cried during the vows. Real tears, the kind that come from somewhere deep and specific, not from performance. The house in Buckhead was my idea. Derek had been looking at condos downtown, something sleek and low maintenance, but I wanted land. I wanted a yard with actual grass, a kitchen I could move, and a front door I could paint whatever color I chose. We found the property in March, a 4-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street with oak trees old enough to have seen other families come and go. The purchase price was $1.4 million. My name went on the mortgage. My credit, my income, my professional history as a licensed real estate attorney, those were the pillars the bank stood on. Derek contributed to the down payment, $180,000 from his savings, and we agreed verbally that the house was ours equally. I drew up the paperwork myself, and I made a decision that I didn't announce, didn't discuss, didn't explain, because at the time, it felt like a technicality, something I'd revisit later. The deed listed one owner, Scarlett Marie Hendricks. Not Scarlett Hendricks Okafor. Not joint tenants. Not community property with right of survivorship. Just me. Derek never asked to see the final documents. He signed what I put in front of him at closing the way people sign things when they trust the person handing them the pen. I told myself I'd add him later, after we settled in after the renovations, after life stopped feeling so logistically overwhelming. Later never came, not because I was scheming, not because some part of me already knew. I think I just understood in the wordless way that practical women understand things, that a piece of paper is not the same as a promise. And a promise is not the same as a guarantee, and a guarantee from another person is the only thing in this world with an expiration date you can't read in advance. My mother taught me that. The laundry facility and the candles and the windows that stuck, they taught me that. So the deed stayed in my name. The property taxes came to my name. The homeowner's insurance policy, the HOA correspondence, the utility accounts, all of it. Scarlett Marie Hendricks solo. Derek saw the mail. He just never read it. For 9 years, that house was genuinely ours, in every way that mattered. We cooked in that kitchen, argued in that driveway, repainted the living room twice, because we couldn't agree on whether the walls should be warm gray or cool gray. We talked about children, then stopped talking about children, then started again, then let the subject go quiet the way subjects do when they become too heavy to keep lifting. We had a good life. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a trap I was waiting to spring. It was a real marriage with real warmth and real history. And what happened to it didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most things fall apart slowly, then, suddenly, in a moment so ordinary you almost miss it. The first moment was a Tuesday in September, 14 months before the Tuesday I'm telling you about now. Derek came home from a conference in Charlotte. He was tired, distracted, pleasant in the surface way of someone managing their energy carefully. He kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, ate dinner without his phone on the table, which was unusual. Derek always had his phone on the table. That night, after he fell asleep, I lay in the dark and tried to name what I was feeling. Not suspicion, not yet. Just a stillness in the room that hadn't been there before, like something had quietly left and the air hadn't adjusted yet. The thing about intuition is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't sit you down and say, listen, something is wrong. It just starts leaving small things in your peripheral vision. A detail that doesn't line up. A pause that runs a half-second too long. A change so incremental that if you tried to explain it to someone else, you'd sound paranoid before you finished the first sentence. I am a lawyer. I deal in evidence. I do not act on feelings alone. So I watched. The phone was the first thing. Derek had always been relaxed about his phone. Left it on the counter, left it in the car, handed it to me once at a concert to take photos because his hands were full. Starting that October, the phone was always face down. Always on silent, always within arm's reach, which sounds like attentiveness until you realize attentiveness and guardedness look identical from a distance. I didn't say anything. The second thing was the gym. Derek had been a 3 times a week gym person for as long as I'd known him. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 6:30 in the morning, back by 8. Consistent the way only people with genuine discipline are consistent. In November, the pattern shifted. Tuesdays and Thursdays started appearing. Then a Saturday morning here and there. Then one Sunday when I woke up at 7, and his side of the bed was already cold. I told myself he was training for something. A half marathon, maybe. He'd mentioned it once in passing. He never ran the half marathon. The third thing was the smell. Not perfume, not yet. Something subtler. A different detergent on his collar one evening in December. Something floral and light that was not the Tide-free and gentle we had used for 6 years because I had a sensitivity to fragrance. I noticed it when he leaned over to look at something on my laptop. I didn't move. I didn't react. I just registered it the way you register a sound in a building that's supposed to be empty with your whole body going quiet at once. I did the laundry that weekend. Every item he'd worn that week. I went through the pockets the way I had not done in years. In the inside breast pocket of his charcoal wool vest, the one he wore to client dinners, I found a receipt. Bacchanalia, West Paces Ferry Road, Atlanta. December 9th, table for 2. $340 before tip. I knew Bacchanalia. I'd been there twice, both times for significant occasions. It was not a casual restaurant. It was not a client dinner restaurant unless the client was extremely important or the dinner was not actually about the client. I put the receipt back in the pocket, folded the vest, set it on his side of the closet. Then I went downstairs, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table for a long time, watching the backyard through the glass doors. The oak tree we could see from the breakfast nook had dropped most of its leaves by then. The yard looked open in a way it didn't in summer, more exposed, the bones of it visible. I had always liked that yard. I had planted a row of gardenias along the back fence in our second year in the house, and they came back every spring without being asked to. I thought about what I knew and what I could prove, and I thought about the difference between those two things, which is something lawyers think about constantly, and wives should probably think about more. I knew something was wrong. I could not yet prove what. January came. Derek was present in the way of someone making an effort, initiating dinners, suggesting a weekend in Savannah to see my mother buying flowers on a random Wednesday grocery store, tulips in a color he knew I liked. The effort was visible. That was the problem. For 11 years, Derek had not needed to make an effort. Things between us had simply moved the way long familiarity moves, easy and unself-conscious. When effort appeared, it had a shape, and the shape was wrong. I accepted the flowers. I booked the trip to Savannah. I sat across from my husband at dinner tables and asked questions about his work, and listened to his answers, and let him believe that things were fine. I was thinking. February brought a work trip to Houston. 4 days. Derek texted regularly, "Good morning, good night." A photo of the hotel breakfast, a voice note complaining about the conference room temperature. All the textures of a man who wanted to be perceived as present. On the third night at 11:17 p.m., he called me. We talked for 40 minutes. Easy conversation, the kind we'd always been good at. He asked about a case I was working. I told him about a zoning dispute that had taken an unexpected turn. He laughed at the right moments. Before he hung up, he said, "I love you," in the particular way he said it, when he meant it low and deliberate, like a statement of fact rather than a formality. I said it back. After the call ended, I sat with my phone in my hand and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Grief. Not anger. Not yet. Grief for the marriage I could feel shifting under my feet like ground that had been quietly flooding for months, the surface still solid looking, the underneath already gone. That was February. By March, I'd hired a private investigator named Curtis, a retired Fulton County detective who charged $150 an hour and communicated exclusively through encrypted email. He sent me his first report on a Thursday morning while I was drinking coffee at the kitchen table under the oak tree's first new leaves of spring. Her name was Jade, 29 years old, event coordinator. They had been seeing each other for approximately 7 months. I read the report twice, closed my laptop, finished my coffee. Then I opened the laptop again, navigated to a folder I had not opened in 3 years, and pulled up the property deed for the house on Andover Drive. Buckhead, Atlanta, Georgia. Scarlett Marie Hendricks. I read my own name for a long moment. Then I opened a new browser tab and searched for the direct line of my estate attorney. I didn't know exactly what I was building yet, but I knew I was building something. And I knew the way my mother knew things, the way women who have been watching carefully for a long time know things that when the moment came, I would be ready. I had no idea Derek was already planning to make the moment come to me. I came home early because of a headache. That's the whole reason. Not instinct, not a tip, not some dramatic sense that the universe was aligning to show me something. I had a deposition scheduled for 3 o'clock that I'd been preparing for all week. and at 1:15, I felt a pressure behind my left eye that I recognized as the early warning of a migraine, the kind that if I didn't get ahead of it immediately would cost me the next 18 hours. I asked my paralegal to reschedule, drove home on Peachtree with my sunglasses on and the radio off. I turned onto Andover Drive at 1:47 p.m. Derek's car was in the driveway. That was the first wrong thing. Derek's office was in Midtown. He didn't work from home on Wednesdays. We had never had a conversation establishing this as a rule. It was simply the pattern, the same way all the other patterns had been simply the pattern until they weren't. I sat in my car in front of my own house for a moment. Then I pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and went inside. The front door was unlocked. I could hear music from the back of the house, something playing through the Sonos system, low and unhurried. Derek's shoes were by the door, the brown leather Oxfords he'd worn to work that morning. Next to them was a pair of sandals I'd never seen before. White strappy, a size smaller than mine. I set my keys on the console table the way I always did. Walked down the hall. The door to the main guest room, the one I had repainted sage green the previous spring, the one with the window seat that looked out over the gardenias, was open. I stopped in the doorway. Jade was standing at the window seat with her back to me, refolding something from an open Louis Vuitton duffel bag, the large one, the Keep All 55 in dusty rose monogram canvas. Her braids were up in a loose knot. She was wearing a cropped sweatshirt and leggings and moving through the room with the unhurried ease of someone who believed she was exactly where she was supposed to be. On the window seat beside her bag, a toiletry case. A phone charger already plugged into the outlet I'd had installed specifically for that room. A paperback novel, face down on the cushion I had chosen from a shop on Miami Circle. She had been here before. That was the detail that hit me first, not the bag, not the charger, not even her presence in my house. The ease. You don't move through a room like that the first time you're in it. She knew where the outlet was without looking. I heard Derek's footsteps on the stairs behind me. He came down carrying a second bag, a smaller one, a backpack, also hers, and he saw me and he stopped. We looked at each other across maybe 8 feet of hallway. His face did something complicated. Surprise, and then something that tried to become composure, and didn't quite make it. And then, and this is the part I have turned over many times, since a flicker of something that looked almost like relief. Like a man who had been waiting for a collision and was tired of waiting. Jade turned around. She looked at me, and then at Derek, and then back at me. And I watched her recalibrate in real time, her expression moving from startled to careful. Nobody spoke for a moment that lasted much longer than it should have. Then Derek said, "You're home early?" Not I can explain, not this isn't what it looks like, which would have been insulting, given that it was exactly what it looked like. Just you're home early, the tone of a man rearranging buying seconds. I said, "I have a migraine." He nodded, set the backpack down against the wall, and then he said the thing. The sentence I've replayed so many times, it is worn smooth like a stone, carried in a pocket for years. He said, "Jade is going to be staying here for a while. She's between places right now. I should have told you sooner." I looked at him. I looked at the bag on my window seat, the charger in my outlet, the novel on my cushion. I said, "How long have you been planning this?" He said, "A few weeks, a few weeks." He had spent a few weeks planning to move his girlfriend into our home, into the guest room down the hall from our bedroom in the house on Andover Drive. In the house with my name on the deed, with the gardenias I planted along the back fence, and had not said a single word. The Sonos was still playing, something slow and jazzy, a station Derek liked. Jade said quietly, "I can give you 2 a minute." I looked at her then, really looked. She was pretty in an open, uncomplicated way, and she seemed genuinely uncomfortable, which told me she was not entirely without conscience, which told me she probably knew more about what this marriage was than Derek had led her to believe about what this marriage was. I said, "No, stay." Then I turned back to Derek. I said, "I'm going to go lie down. My head is killing me." I went upstairs, took 2 Excedrin and a glass of water, drew the blackout curtains in our bedroom, lay on my side of the bed in my work clothes, and stared at the dark for a while. My phone was on the nightstand. I did not call anyone. I did not cry. I did not lie there cycling through fury and disbelief the way the situation seemed to call for. I thought about my mother, and the candles and the windows that stuck. I thought about the widow in my first-year seminar, who had 60 days to vacate a home she'd lived in for 31 years. I thought about a PDF file in a folder on my laptop last modified 3 years ago that I'd opened twice since and never changed. And I thought about Marcus Webb, my estate attorney, who had sent me a birthday card every year for the past 9 years, and answered his phone on the second ring. At 9 p.m., I heard the house go quiet. Derek and Jade settling somewhere on the first-floor television on low, the ordinary sounds of people ending an evening. I got up, went to my home office at the end of the hall, sat down at my desk without turning on the overhead light, just the small lamp in the corner, opened my laptop, pulled up the deed, pulled up a second document beside it, a post-nuptial property agreement I had drafted and never executed, sitting in the same folder, waiting with the patience of paperwork. I read it through once. Then I opened a new email to Marcus Webb, typed 4 sentences, and hit send. His reply came at 9:43 p.m., available tomorrow at 8. Bring everything. I closed the laptop, went back to bed, slept better than I had in months. Marcus Webb's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Center Avenue, with a view of downtown Atlanta that on clear mornings looked almost cinematic, the skyline catching early light. The city laid out below like something that could be held. I had been his client for 11 years. He had handled my first property acquisition, a small duplex in East Point I bought at 29, with money I had saved since law school. He had handled every transaction since 5 properties in total, 3 of which I still owned. 2 I had sold at margins that still gave me quiet satisfaction when I thought about them. He knew my professional history, my financial architecture, the particular way I approached risk, carefully, completely, with documentation for everything. He was 61 years old, small and precise, with reading glasses he wore on a chain, and a habit of letting silence do work in a conversation that most people would rush to fill. I arrived at 7:58. He was already at his desk. I sat down across from him, and I opened my bag, and I put 3 things on the desk between us. The property deed for 1847 Andover Drive, the post-nuptial agreement I had drafted 3 years ago and never executed, and the investigator's report from Curtis, 41 pages photographs, included timeline going back 7 months. Marcus looked at all 3 without touching them. Then he looked at me over his glasses. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Officially since March. The rest of it I think I've known longer than that." He nodded once, picked up the deed first. He read it the way lawyers read documents, not for content. He already knew the content. He had drafted the original, but for confirmation, for the specific comfort of seeing the language hold. Then he set it down and picked up the post-nuptial agreement. He read through it slowly, turned to page 3, read that page twice. He said, "You drafted this yourself?" I said, "Yes." He said, 3 years ago. I said, "I was having a feeling I couldn't name yet, so I wrote it down instead." He looked at me for a moment with an expression I had seen on him before. Not admiration, exactly, more like recognition. The look of someone who respects another person's particular kind of intelligence. He said, "What do you want to do?" I had thought about this question for approximately 14 hours, lying in the dark of my bedroom, while Derek and Jade watched television one floor below me. I had turned it over the way I turned over complex cases, not emotionally, not yet, but structurally. What were the assets? What was the exposure? What did the papers say versus what did the situation feel like, and how much did the gap between those two things matter? I said, "I want to execute the post-nuptial agreement. I want it notarized and filed before the end of the week. I want an updated title search on all 5 properties. And I want you to review the operating agreement for the Okafor Reeves LLC and tell me exactly where my name appears and in what capacity." Marcus wrote 3 lines on his legal pad. Then he said, "The LLC." I said, "Derek co-founded it in 2019. I provided $60,000 in startup capital as a documented personal loan. The operating agreement lists me as a secured creditor with a conversion clause. If the loan is not repaid within 7 years, I have the option to convert it to a 22% equity stake." Marcus took his glasses off. He said, "Does Derek know about the conversion clause?" I said, "He signed the agreement." Another silence. He said, "Scarlett." I said, "He signed it, Marcus." I handed him the pen. He put his glasses back on, looked down at his legal pad, wrote 2 more lines. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. By the time I left, 3 things were in motion: a title search across all 5 properties, a formal review of the LLC operating agreement by Marcus's corporate partner, and an appointment the following Tuesday with a notary to execute the post-nuptial agreement that had been sitting in a folder on my laptop patient and undetonated for 3 years. I drove to my office afterward, took the elevator to the 6th floor, sat at my desk and checked my calendar and answered 4 emails and reviewed a closing package for a client in Sandy Springs. My paralegal Denise brought me coffee at 11 and asked how I was feeling. She remembered the migraine or the reason I'd given for the migraine. I said, "Better, thank you." She left. I picked up my coffee. Outside my window, Peachtree Street moved through a normal Thursday morning. Taxis, pedestrians, a delivery truck double parked with its hazards on. The city doing what cities do, indifferent and continuous. I thought about Jade in my guest room. Her braids in a loose knot, the dusty rose duffel on my window seat, the charger plugged into my outlet. I thought about Derek saying she's between places right now, in the tone of a man describing a logistical inconvenience, rather than a fundamental dismantling of a marriage. I thought about the post-nuptial agreement, and the deed, and the conversion clause, and the $60,000 I had transferred from my personal account in April of 2019, documented with a promissory note I had insisted on over Derek's mild objection that it was unnecessary because we're married, Scarlett. It's all one pot. I had smiled when he said that. Agreed that yes, in many ways, it was all one pot. And then I had filed the promissory note in the same folder as everything else. My mother grew up in a house with 6 people and 1 income and windows that stuck in summer. She worked nights for 23 years. She never owned the house we lived in. When the landlord sold the building in 2004, she had 45 days to find somewhere else to go. And she found it, because she was the kind of woman who always found it, but she shouldn't have had to. I had understood something at 26 in that seminar room that I'd never once unlearned. Paper is not the same as a promise. And a promise from someone else is the only thing in this world with an expiration date you cannot read in advance. That evening, I came home to the smell of cooking. Jade was in my kitchen. She was making pasta, something with garlic and olive oil, and she had found the good pan, the all-clad sauté pan I used for everything. And she was using it without asking. And she looked up when I walked in and said hi. The way someone says hi when they are trying to seem unintimidating. Derek was at the kitchen island with a glass of wine. He said, "Jade cooked. There's enough for 3. I set my bag down. I looked at my good pan on my stove. I said, "That's thoughtful." I went upstairs, changed out of my work clothes, washed my face, stood at the bathroom mirror for a moment, and looked at myself, really looked the way you don't always let yourself do. Then I went back downstairs, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I ate pasta from my own plates with my husband and his girlfriend. And I asked Jade about her work, and she told me about an event she was coordinating in Buckhead. And I listened and nodded and said the right things at the right moments. Derek watched me the entire meal with the careful attention of a man waiting for an explosion. There was no explosion. After dinner, I loaded the dishwasher, said goodnight to both of them, and went to bed. At 11 p.m., my phone buzzed with an email from Marcus's corporate partner. Initial review of LLC operating agreement complete. Conversion clause is airtight. Call me tomorrow. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand, closed my eyes, listened to the house settle around me. My house, my walls, my floors, my gardenias dormant in the dark backyard, waiting for spring. Let them have tonight, I thought. There were only a few more nights left to have. The dinner was Evelyn Okafor's idea. Derek's mother hosted a family dinner on the last Sunday of every month at her home in Stone Mountain, a sprawling ranch house she had lived in for 30 years, with a dining table that seated 12 and a kitchen that was always producing something from scratch. These dinners were not optional. Evelyn did not phrase things as invitations. She phoned on Tuesday, told you what time to arrive, and expected to see you at the door with something in your hands, wine flowers, a dessert, something that demonstrated you had been raised correctly. I had attended every single one for 11 years. I genuinely loved Evelyn. That was the complicated part. She was sharp and warm and funny in the dry, understated way of women who have seen enough of life to find most of it mildly absurd. She had welcomed me into her family without ceremony or condition, which I had not taken for granted then, and did not take for granted now. She called me on my birthday before she called Derek. She had framed a photo of just the two of us from a trip to Charleston and put it in her living room. When Derek called her on Thursday to say he was bringing a guest to Sunday dinner, she called me on Friday. She said, "He told me he's bringing someone." I said, "Yes." A pause. Evelyn was not a woman who paused often. She said, "Scarlett." I said, "I know Evelyn." Another pause. She said, "Do you need me to?" I said, "No, I'm fine. I'll see you Sunday." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said in a different register, lower, more direct, "You know I love you like my own." I said, "I know." I meant it. She meant it. That was a real thing in the middle of all the unreal things, and I held on to it. Sunday came the way Sundays do, slowly and then all at once. I dressed carefully. Not in the way of a woman trying to compete. I was 38 years old, and I had long since stopped dressing for anyone's benefit but my own. I wore a deep burgundy wrap dress I had bought in October and hadn't worn yet, and low heels and the small gold earrings my mother gave me when I passed the bar. I did my hair and my makeup with the same quiet attention I brought to everything. Derek knocked on the bathroom door at 4:15 and said we should leave by 4:30. I said, "I'll be ready." He opened the door and looked at me in the mirror, and something moved across his face. Not guilt, not quite more, like the recognition of something he had already decided to stop allowing himself to feel. He said, "You look nice." I said, "Thank you, Derek." We drove separately. I told him I'd meet him there. He didn't argue. I arrived at Evelyn's at 4:48. Derek's car was already in the driveway. So was his sister Paulette's. And next to Paulette's RAV4, a rental car, a white Nissan Sentra with a Hertz sticker on the bumper. I sat in my car for one breath. Then I got out, picked up the 2 bottles of Bordeaux I'd brought from the back seat, and walked to the front door. Evelyn opened it before I could knock. She took one of the wine bottles and held the door and looked at me with an expression I will carry for a long time. Something between an apology and an admiration. The look of a woman who understood exactly what she was watching and had enormous respect for the way I was choosing to walk through it. She squeezed my hand once, said nothing. I went inside. The living room held Derek, his sister Paulette, Paulette's husband, Jerome, Derek's younger brother Corey, and Jade. Jade was sitting on the love seat in the corner wearing a yellow dress and small gold hoops, her braids down a glass of sparkling water in her hand. She looked up when I entered. Her expression did the careful thing it had been doing all week, pleasant, and contained the expression of someone managing a situation they had not fully anticipated. Derek stood. His posture had the specific stiffness of a man bracing. The room did the thing rooms do. When something unspoken is present, conversation didn't stop exactly, but it thinned, became surface level. Everyone slightly more aware of their own body language. Paulette hugged me. Her hug lasted a half-second longer than usual, which told me everything about where she stood. Corey gave me a nod and went back to his phone. Jerome shook my hand and immediately started talking about the Falcons with the energy of a man who understood his role was to create noise. I sat in the armchair across the room, accepted a glass of wine from Evelyn, and turned to Jade. I said, "I don't think we've been properly introduced. I'm Scarlett." She said, "I know. I'm Jade." I said, "How are you finding Atlanta?" She said she liked it. Said the food was incredible, that she'd been to Ponce City Market twice already, that the weather was better than she'd expected for the time of year. I asked where she was from originally. She said Charlotte. I said I had been there recently for a closing and had eaten at a restaurant downtown she should try next time she visited. I named the restaurant. She wrote it down in her phone. Derek was watching me from across the room with the expression of a man who has prepared for one scenario and is now living inside a completely different one. Dinner was served at 6. Evelyn had made oxtail rice and peas, fried plantains, and a cucumber salad that had been her mother's recipe. The table was set formally cloth napkins, and the good china candles in the center. I sat at my usual seat, Evelyn's right, where I had sat for 11 years. Derek sat across from me. Jade sat 2 seats down from Derek between Corey and Jerome. We ate. The conversation moved through the normal channels. Paulette's kids, Jerome's job, a renovation Evelyn was considering for the back porch. Normal family dinner conversation with a fault line running underneath it that everyone could feel, but only some people were acknowledging. At some point, Corey, who was 27 and had not yet developed the social calibration that comes with age, looked at Jade and said, "So how do you know Derek?" The table went briefly quiet. Jade looked at Derek. Derek looked at his plate. I picked up my wine glass, and then I said pleasantly to no one in particular, "She's staying at the house for a while. Derek mentioned she was between places." I looked at Jade when I said it, and I smiled the specific smile of a woman who is in complete control of the temperature in the room. Jade said, "That's right." Corey looked between us, decided to eat his plantain. Jerome said something about the Falcons. Evelyn looked at me from the head of the table with an expression I recognized, the same expression my mother wore when I handled something difficult in a way she hadn't expected, but had somehow already known I was capable of. After dinner, while Evelyn was serving dessert, Derek found me in the kitchen. He said quietly, "You don't have to do this." I said, "Do what?" He said, "Be like this." I turned to look at him. I said, "Derek, I am standing in your mother's kitchen helping plate sweet potato pie. What exactly is it you think I'm doing?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "You're being too calm." I said, "Or you're waiting for something that isn't coming." I picked up 2 plates of pie and walked back to the dining room. On my way past the living room, I stopped at the mantel and looked at the framed photo of Evelyn and me in Charleston. We were standing on a battery overlooking the harbor, both of us laughing at something just out of frame, the afternoon light coming in from the left. I looked at it for one moment. Then I carried the pie to the table, set a plate in front of Paulette, sat down in my chair and said, "Evelyn, this looks incredible." Evelyn looked at me from the head of the table. She said, "Welcome to my home, baby. Same as always?" She looked at me when she said it. Not at the table, at me. And in that look was everything she could not say in front of her son. The apology, the love, the furious pride, and something else. Something older and more essential. The acknowledgement of one woman by another who had seen the same things and chosen the same kind of quiet. I nodded once, picked up my fork, ate my pie. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. Not to the house. Derek had never been careful about mail at the house. Had always assumed I handled it the way I handled most logistical things, with quiet competence and without needing to be asked. Marcus had sent it to Derek's office by certified mail return receipt, requested addressed to Derek Okafor personally, and marked legal notice time sensitive on the outside of the envelope. I know the exact sequence of what happened next because Derek's assistant, a young woman named Priya, who had worked with him for 3 years and had the particular loyalty of someone who respected competence over rank, called me at 11:47 a.m. She said, "Scarlett, I just want you to know he got something in the mail this morning and he's been in his office with the door closed for 40 minutes. I said, "Thank you, Priya." She said, "I just thought you should know." I said, "I appreciate that." I set my phone down and looked out my office window at Peachtree Street and thought about Derek sitting behind his closed door on the 14th floor of his Midtown building, reading a letter he had not known was coming, learning things about the architecture of his own life that he had signed his name to without reading carefully enough. Marcus had sent 4 documents. The first was a formal notice of my intent to execute the post-nuptial property agreement, with a 14-day window for Derek to retain independent counsel and review. The second was a title search summary across all 5 properties. 1847 Andover. Drive 3 rental units in West End and Decatur, and a commercial property in College Park I had acquired 2 years before we married. All 5 listed sole owner Scarlett Marie Hendricks. Combined current market value $4.2 million. The third was a review of the Okafor Reeves LLC operating agreement prepared by Marcus's corporate partner, which confirmed the conversion clause. In plain language, the $60,000 personal loan I had extended in April 2019. Documented by a promissory note. Signed by Derek. And witnessed by a notary, carried an option exercisable at my sole discretion after 7 years or upon material breach of the loan terms to convert to a 22% equity stake in the company. The company that Derek and his partner Raymond Reeves had spent 5 years building was currently valued according to their most recent investor deck at $3.8 million. 22% of $3.8 million was $836,000. The fourth document was a single page. A letter from me written in plain language, not legal language, the kind of letter a person writes when they want to be understood rather than interpreted. It said, "Derek, I have not made any decisions yet. I am asking you to make one. Retain a lawyer, review the documents, understand what exists on paper before you decide what you want to do next. I have given you 14 days. I suggest you use them. S." I had written it at 6 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, while the house was still quiet, and Jade was still asleep in the guest room, and the backyard was silver with early light. I had read it twice, changed 2 words, printed it and signed it by hand. My signature was steady. I noticed that. Derek called me at 12:30. I let it ring. He called again at 12:41. I let it ring. At 1:15, he sent a text. It said, "Can you please answer your phone?" At 2 o'clock, I stepped out of a client meeting, found a quiet corner near the elevator bank, and called him back. He answered on the first ring. His voice had the compressed quality of a man who had been sitting with something explosive for 2 hours and was working very hard to remain measured. He said, "What is this?" Not a question, a statement that wanted to be a question. I said, "It's what it says it is, Derek. It's a formal notice." He said, "The house is in your name." I said, "It has always been in my name." A silence that had a particular texture, not empty, full of things being processed rapidly, calculations being run. The sound of a man reorganizing everything he thought he knew about the structure of his own life. He said, "The LLC." I said, "You signed the promissory note. The conversion clause is on page 4. He said, "Scarlett, I signed that years ago. We were married. I didn't read." I said, "I know you didn't read it." Another silence. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to get a lawyer. I want you to understand what exists on paper. And then I want you to come to me with a conversation, not a reaction." He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "I've been prepared. Those are different things." He said, "For how long?" I thought about my mother and the windows that stuck. I thought about the seminar room at Emory and the widow with 60 days. I thought about a 26-year-old woman writing 3 words in the margin of her notes: "Never again. Ever." I said, "Since before I met you." He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, and this was the first time in weeks that he sounded like the man I had married, rather than the man I had been watching manage a situation. He said, "I didn't think you'd do this." I said, "I know." He said, I thought you'd want to talk." I said, "Derek, I have been sitting in the same house as you and your girlfriend for 2 weeks. I have eaten dinner at your mother's table. I've been talking. You just weren't listening to the right language." A long pause. He said, "The gala is in 3 weeks. The Peachtree Business Collective. Annual Gala, a black tie fundraiser at the St. Regis that Derek's firm co-sponsored every year, attended by most of the serious professional community in Atlanta. Derek was on the host committee. I had been his +1 for 6 consecutive years. I said, "I know when the gala is." He said, "I need you to understand that this is going to..." I said, "Get a lawyer, Derek." I hung up, went back into my meeting, sat down at the conference table and picked up where I'd left off a zoning dispute in Buckhead. A client who needed an easement negotiated before the end of the month, and I worked with full attention for the rest of the afternoon, because the work was real, and the work was mine, and the work had never let me down. At 5:30, I gathered my things and rode the elevator down to the parking deck. I drove home on Peachtree with the radio off, pulled into the driveway of the house on Andover Drive. Sat for a moment in the car, engine off, looking at the front door. I had painted Benjamin Moore Newburyport blue. In the second year we lived there, a color Derek had said was too bold, and which had turned out to be exactly right. The light was on in the guest room. I got out, took my bag from the back seat, walked to the front door, unlocked it, went inside. Jade was in the living room with a book. She looked up. I said, "Good evening." She said, "Hi." I went to the kitchen, made tea, stood at the counter while the kettle heated, and looked out at the backyard at the gardenias along the back fence that had started their first tentative growth of the season, pale green, at the tips cautious reaching. I thought 3 weeks until the gala. 3 weeks was enough. 3 weeks was more than enough. The St. Regis Atlanta sits on Peachtree Road in Buckhead, like a statement all marble and restraint, the kind of building that understands its own weight and doesn't need to announce it. I had been inside it many times. I knew the layout of the ballroom on the second floor, the way the chandeliers threw warm light across the room, the acoustic particular to a space filled with 300 people, who were all in various ways performing a version of themselves. I arrived at 7:42, not with Derek. I arrived with two people, Marcus Webb, who had agreed to attend when I asked him on Monday, and a woman named Diane Forsyth, a senior partner at my firm, who had known Derek professionally for 4 years, and who I had briefed carefully and selectively the previous Friday over lunch at a restaurant in Virginia Highland. Diane had listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she had set down her fork and said, "What do you need from me?" I had told her. She had said, "I'll be there." That was the thing about women who had been building things for a long time. They understood the architecture of a moment. They knew when to show up and where to stand. We checked our coats, accepted champagne from a passing tray, moved into the ballroom. The room was full, Atlanta's professional class, dressed in black tie, the particular energy of people who had spent the week working hard, and were now spending the evening making sure the right people knew it. I recognized faces from real estate, finance, law, city government, the nonprofit sector. Faces I had been seeing at events like this for a decade. Faces that knew my name and Derek's name, and in some cases already knew through the osmosis of professional social circles, which are smaller and more porous than they appear, that something was happening in the Okafor marriage. I wore a column gown in deep midnight blue, long-sleeved with small diamond studs, and my hair down pressed and smooth. I had spent 45 minutes on my makeup, not to look glamorous, though I did, but to look settled, unperturbed. The visual language of a woman who is exactly where she expected to be. I saw Derek at 8:11. He was at the host committee table near the east wall in a black tuxedo talking to Raymond Reeves, his business partner, co-founder of the LLC, a man who had shaken my hand at least 40 times over 5 years, and called me the brains of that operation once at a Christmas party in a way that was meant as a joke and had not been. Jade was beside him. She was wearing a green halter gown, her braids up in an elaborate style, and she was standing close to Derek in the particular way of someone who understood they were in a public context requiring calibration. She looked beautiful and slightly uncomfortable, which was the accurate combination for the situation she was in. Derek saw me across the room at approximately the same moment I saw him. His expression did several things in rapid succession. I held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then I smiled, not at him, past him, at someone behind his left shoulder, and turned back to Marcus. Marcus said quietly, "Ready?" I said, "Give it an hour." We worked the room. That is the honest description. I worked the room the way I had always worked rooms, with attention and genuine warmth, because most of the people in it I had real relationships with and had not stopped having real relationships with simply because my marriage was ending. I talked to a city councilwoman about a development project in Pittsburgh that I had been following. I talked to a developer from Cobb County about a commercial corridor I thought had been undervalued for years. I talked to Diane's husband, a cardiologist, about a hiking trail in North Georgia he had been recommending to me for 2 years, and which I had finally decided to take seriously. I was in every visible way completely fine. At 9:15, Marcus touched my elbow. He said, "Table 12." Table 12 was the host committee table. Derek was seated. Raymond Reeves was seated. 3 other members of the host committee were seated. Jade was beside Derek, her chair turned slightly toward him, their body language the particular intimacy of a couple who had not yet learned to manage it in public. I walked to the table, not hurried, not slow, the walk of a woman who belongs in every room she enters. I stopped at Derek's right side. He looked up. I said, "Derek, Raymond." I nodded at the others. "Good evening." Raymond said, "Scarlett, you look stunning." I said, "Thank you, Raymond. I need a moment with the table. Something in my tone, not harsh, not cold, simply certain, caused Raymond to straighten slightly. The other host committee members went quiet in the way people go quiet when they sense that the actual event of the evening is happening. Derek said, "Scarlett," I said, "this will take 2 minutes." I reached into the small black clutch I was carrying. I took out a sealed envelope, letter-sized cream, with Derek's full name written on the front in my handwriting, and I placed it on the table in front of him. The table looked at the envelope. Derek looked at the envelope. I said, "I had Marcus prepare the divorce filing this afternoon. It will be submitted to Fulton County Superior Court tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The grounds are adultery, which is documented. The asset division is based on titled ownership, which is also documented, and which you've had 2 weeks and an attorney to review." I paused. The ballroom continued its noise around us, the clink of glasses, the low current of 300 conversations. But at table 12, there was a specific silence, of the kind that happens when 14 people are all holding their breath at the same time. I said, "The post-nuptial agreement is executed and filed. The LLC conversion clause notice is attached. I'm exercising my option effective the date of filing. Marcus will be in touch with Raymond directly tomorrow regarding the equity restructuring." Raymond Reeves said, "I'm sorry what I said." "Page 4 of the operating agreement, Raymond. You'll want to have your attorney pull it tonight." Raymond looked at Derek. Derek was looking at the envelope. His face had gone through several expressions since I'd begun, and had arrived finally at something I had not seen on it before, not anger, not shock, but a kind of stillness that was the expression of a man who has just understood completely, and all at once, the full dimensions of what he had walked into. Jade had gone very still beside him. I looked at her. I said without unkindness, because unkindness was not the point, and had never been the point. "The house will be vacated by the 15th. Marcus has the timeline." She didn't say anything. I looked at Derek one final time. He said very quietly, "Scarlett." I said, "Get a good lawyer, Derek. You've had 2 weeks. I hope you use them." I picked up my clutch. I turned. Diane was waiting at the edge of the room. Her champagne glass raised slightly, her expression, the composed satisfaction of a woman watching something she had been told about come together exactly as described. Marcus fell into step beside me. He said under his breath, 14 people at that table." I said, "I know." He said, "Raymond looked like he was going to be sick." I said, "He should have read the operating agreement." We walked toward the bar. The room continued around us, warm and loud and luminous, the chandeliers throwing their light across 300 people who were in various ways performing versions of themselves. I accepted a fresh glass of champagne from the bar, held it for a moment. Midnight blue against the gold light of the room. Behind me at table 12, I heard the low, urgent sound of Derek's voice, beginning to explain something to Raymond Reeves that Raymond Reeves was not going to want to hear. I did not turn around. I took a sip of my champagne. And I thought, there it is. The first domino fell at 11:17 p.m. while I was still at the gala. I know the exact time because Marcus showed me the email on his phone while we were standing near the coat check waiting for Diane to retrieve her wrap. It was from Raymond Reeves's personal attorney, a man named Caldwell, who Marcus knew professionally, who had apparently been reached by phone during the gala, pulled the LLC operating agreement from his files, read page 4, and sent an email that contained 3 sentences and no salutation. The third sentence was, "Raymond needs to understand the full exposure here before the market opens tomorrow." Marcus read it twice, put his phone in his pocket, said nothing. I said, "That was fast." He said, "Raymond is a businessman. He processed it quickly." I said, "Good." We collected our coats. I said goodnight to Diane, who squeezed my hand, and said, "Call me tomorrow," in the tone of someone who expected the call to be interesting. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, walked through the marble foyer of the St. Regis, and out into the Atlanta night, which was cool and clear, the kind of April evening that smells like cut grass and possibility. I drove home. The house on Andover Drive was lit from inside, guest room light on living room light, on the warm yellow glow of a house occupied by people who did not yet know they were leaving it. I parked in the driveway, sat for a moment with the engine off. Then I went inside. Jade was in the living room, still in her green gown, heels off, feet tucked under her on the sofa. My sofa, the one I had reupholstered in November, the one where I had first seen her 3 weeks ago, with a remote control in her hand. She was looking at her phone, and she looked up when I came in, and her expression did the thing it had been doing for weeks, careful, contained managing. She said, "He's not back yet." I said, "I know." I set my clutch on the console table. She said, "What happened tonight?" I looked at her. She had the expression of someone who had been sitting with partial information for several hours and had run every scenario she could think of and still didn't have the full picture. I said, "Derek will explain when he gets home." She said, "The house." I said, "The 15th. Marcus's office will send the formal notice tomorrow." She looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted in her face. Not anger, not entirely. Something more complicated. The expression of a woman recalibrating, not just a situation, but a story she'd been told about the situation. She said, "He told me it was his house too." I said, "I know he did." She said, "He said you two had an agreement." I said, "We did. He just didn't read it carefully enough." A silence. She said, "I'm not." She stopped, started again. "I'm not a bad person." I looked at her for a moment. She was 29 years old, and she was sitting on my sofa in a green gown at midnight. And she had the specific vulnerability of someone who has just realized that the ground they were standing on belonged to someone else entirely. I said, "I believe you." She looked surprised. I said, "But that doesn't change the paperwork." I went upstairs. Derek came home at 12:48. I heard his car in the driveway, heard the front door, heard the low, urgent murmur of voices from the first floor. His and Jade's, the compressed energy of two people processing the same event from different angles. I lay in the dark and listened to the house. At 1:15, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Derek came to the bedroom door, stood in the doorway. The hallway light was behind him, and I could see his silhouette, but not his expression. He said, "Scarlett." I said, "Derek." He said, "Raymond called me 4 times on the drive home." I said, "I know." He said, "His attorney is recommending he seek an injunction to." I said, "His attorney can recommend whatever he likes. The conversion clause is airtight. Marcus's corporate partner spent 10 days on it." A silence. He said, "You're taking 22% of my company." I said, "I'm exercising a clause in a legal agreement you signed." "There's a difference." He said, "Scarlett, that company is 5 years of my life." I said, "And the $60,000 was 5 years of my savings." He didn't say anything. I said, "Derek, you moved your girlfriend into my house. You brought her to your mother's dinner table. You stood in the hallway and told me she was staying without asking me, without warning me, without treating me like a person who had a right to know." I paused. "What did you think was going to happen?" He said, "I didn't think you'd go this far." I said, "You didn't think I could?" Another silence. Longer this time. He said, "No." The honesty of it was almost startling. No performance, no defense. Just a flat admission from a man who had spent 11 years watching me handle everything quietly and had mistaken competence for passivity. I said, "Now you know." He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said quietly, "The house, is there any?" I said, "No." He said, "Scarlett." I said, No, Derek. He was quiet. I said, "You have until the 15th. That's 3 weeks. It's more than enough time." He left the doorway. I heard him go back downstairs. Heard the murmur of voices again lower, this time the sound of a conversation that had stopped being about strategy and become about logistics. I closed my eyes. The second domino fell the next morning. Raymond Reeves arrived at Derek's office at 8 a.m., before the coffee was made, and they were in the conference room for 2 hours. I know this because Priya texted me at 10:15 long morning. Just so you know. At noon, Raymond's attorney filed a request for mediation rather than an injunction, a significant downgrade in aggression that told me Caldwell had reviewed the document thoroughly and given Raymond an honest assessment of his odds. The third domino fell that afternoon. Derek's 2 largest clients, a development group out of Charlotte and a family office in Sandy Springs, that together represented approximately 40% of his firm's revenue, both requested calls with Derek that day. I do not know exactly what was said on those calls. What I know is that by Thursday morning, one of them had asked to pause their engagement pending clarity on the LLC situation, and the other had sent a formal letter of inquiry to Derek's compliance officer. Professional communities in Atlanta are not large. Information moves through them the way water moves through limestone, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once, having carved channels you didn't know existed. The fourth domino fell on Wednesday. Evelyn called me at 9 a.m. She said, "I owe you an apology." I said, "Evelyn, you don't owe me anything." She said, "I knew something was wrong before that dinner. I should have. I didn't want to see it." A pause. "I should have called you sooner." I said, "You called me when you could." She said, "He's my son, and I love him, but what he did." She stopped. I could hear her composing herself, the particular sound of a woman who has been practical her entire life, allowing herself one moment of not being practical. She said, "You were always the right one for him. He didn't know how to be the right one back." I said, "I know." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "Nothing right now, but I'll call you." She said, "You better." The fifth domino, the one I had not anticipated, fell on Thursday evening. Jade knocked on my home office door at 7 p.m. I said, "Come in." She stood in the doorway with the careful posture of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say and was now not entirely sure it was going to come out right. She said, "I'm leaving tomorrow. I found a short-term rental in Midtown." I said, "Okay." She said, "I just wanted to tell you myself." I looked at her. She was 29 years old, and she was standing in the doorway of my home office, and she had the expression of someone who had spent the past week revising her understanding of a story she thought she knew. She said, "He told me you two were basically separated, that you had been for a year, that the house situation was complicated, but you'd both agreed it was over." I said, "I know what he told you." She said, "I wouldn't have." She stopped. "I'm not saying that as an excuse. She looked at her hands. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "It doesn't, but I appreciate you saying it." She nodded, turned to go. I said, "Jade." She stopped. I said, "Find someone who tells you the truth about what you're walking into." She looked at me. Something moved across her face, not quite gratitude, more like recognition. The look of a young woman filing something away for later. She said, "Yes, ma'am." She left. I sat in my home office for a while after that in the quiet of the house, the lamp in the corner throwing its small, warm circle. Outside the backyard was dark. The gardenias along the back fence were invisible in the night, but I knew they were there. but growing unhurried, coming back the way they came back every year without being asked. Friday morning, Jade left with her Louis Vuitton duffel and her smaller bag and her phone charger. I stood in the doorway of the guest room after she was gone and looked at the space, the window seat, the sage green wall, the cushion I had chosen from a shop on Miami Circle. The room looked exactly like mine again. It had never stopped being mine. Derek moved out on a Sunday, not the 15th 4 days before it. I came downstairs at 7 a.m. to find him already at it, moving quietly through the house with the focused efficiency of a man who had decided that prolonging the process was its own kind of cruelty. He had rented a truck. He had called Corey to help. They worked without asking me where things went or which things were his, because Derek had always known exactly which things were his, which was fewer things than he had perhaps understood until he was standing in the middle of the life we had built together and cataloging what he could take. The furniture stayed. We had bought most of it together, but it was in rooms I had designed in a house that was mine, and Derek did not ask for any of it. He took his clothing, his books, his record collection, 247 vinyl albums in wooden crates that Corey carried out to the truck with the careful reverence of someone handling something genuinely loved. He took the cast iron skillet his grandmother had given him. He took a framed photograph from the hallway, just a picture of his father, who had died 6 years ago, standing in front of a car in what looked like the late 70s, young and proud and squinting into the sun. He left everything else. I sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and did not offer to help and did not make it harder. That felt like the right balance. We had been married for 11 years, and there was a history between us that deserved something, not sentimentality, not performance, but a basic human acknowledgement that this had been real and was now ending, and that the ending did not require additional damage. At 10:40, Derek came to the kitchen doorway. He said, "I think that's everything." I said, "Okay." He stood there for a moment. Corey was outside. I could hear the truck running the low idle of an engine waiting. Derek said, "The cast iron was my grandmother's." I said, "I know. Take it." He said, "I already did." I said, "Good." A silence that had a different quality than the silences of the past 3 weeks, less charged, more exhausted, the silence of two people at the end of something rather than the middle of it. He said, "I handled this badly." I looked at him. He said, I know it doesn't help. He stopped, started again. "I don't know when it started going wrong. I've been trying to figure that out, and I can't find the moment. It was just," I said, slow and then sudden. He looked at me. I said, "That's how most things fall apart." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were always smarter than me." I said, "That was never the problem." He said, "No, I know." He looked around the kitchen one more time at the all-clad pan, on the hook at the coffee maker he had bought me for Christmas 4 years ago at the backyard. Through the glass doors, the gardenias starting to bloom along the back fence, pale white against the green. He said, "Take care of the gardenias." I said, "I always have." He left. I heard the front door close, heard the truck pull out of the driveway, sat at the table until the sound of the engine faded completely and the street went quiet. Then I got up, rinsed my coffee mug, and opened the back door. Walked out into the yard in the cool morning air in my bare feet on the damp grass, and stood at the back fence looking at the gardenias. They were coming in strong this year. I don't know why. The same soil, the same sun, the same Atlanta spring they'd had every year for 9 years. But they were fuller than I'd seen them. The blooms larger, the green deeper, the whole row of them, pushing forward with a kind of uncomplicated insistence that I found standing there in my bare feet on a Sunday morning, genuinely moving. I stood there for a while. Then I went inside and called my mother. She answered on the second ring, the way she always did, the way she had answered every phone call of my life, like she had been expecting to hear from me and was glad I had finally called. I said, "He moved out this morning." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Like the ground is solid again." She said, "Good." She didn't say "I told you so," because she never had, because she was not that kind of woman. She said, "Are you eating?" I said, "I'm going to make eggs." She said, "With a good pan?" I said, "With the good pan." She said, "That's my girl." The professional fallout continued through the following 2 weeks, with the systematic momentum of something that had been properly set in motion. Raymond Reeves and his attorney entered mediation with Marcus regarding the LLC equity conversion. The mediation took 3 sessions over 6 days. Raymond was a pragmatic man, a businessman, who once he understood that the legal foundation was solid and the outcome of a court challenge, uncertain and expensive, chose to negotiate rather than litigate. He was also, I learned later from Marcus, furious with Derek, not for the marriage, which was not Raymond's business, but for the conversion clause, which was. He signed that document and never told me about the exposure Raymond had apparently said in the second mediation session. I've been operating on the assumption that equity was clean. It was not clean. The mediation concluded with an agreement. My 22% equity stake would be purchased out at current valuation, $836,000, paid in 2 tranches over 18 months, in exchange for my formal release of the conversion option and a clean exit from the LLC structure. Marcus negotiated a 3% premium on the second tranche as a concession for the payment schedule. I signed the agreement on a Thursday afternoon in Marcus's office on Peachtree Center Avenue, with the Atlanta skyline through the window catching the late afternoon light. Marcus passed me the pen. I signed my name, set the pen down, said, "What's the total with the premium?" He said, $862,400. I said, "Okay." He looked at me over his glasses. I said, "What?" He said, "Nothing. I've just been your attorney for 11 years, and I've never once seen you surprised by a number you already knew was coming." I said, "My mother taught me to know the number before you walk in the room." He said, "Smart woman." I said, "The smartest." Derek's 2 major clients both departed within the month. One formally won. Through a slow cessation of engagement that amounted to the same thing. His firm lost approximately 40% of its revenue in 6 weeks. He was not ruined. He was a capable man, with a strong professional reputation and the kind of resilience that comes from having built something once before. But he was diminished, and the diminishment was public in the particular way that Atlanta's professional community made things public, not loudly, not cruelly, just completely. The gala table had held 14 people. 14 people talk. Evelyn called me twice in the weeks after Derek moved out. Once to check on me. Once to tell me that Derek had called her, that they had talked for a long time, that she chose the word carefully, reckoning. I appreciated that word. It was the right one. Not punished, not destroyed, but reckoning, which is its own kind of work and necessary. She said, "He asked about you." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him you were fine. I told him you were always going to be fine." I said, "You were right." She said, "I know my girls." She said, "My girls." Present tense. I noted that. On the last day of April, I drove to Andover Drive, and I pulled up in front of the house, and I sat in my car, and I looked at it. The Newburyport blue front door, the oak trees in the yard, the gutters I'd been meaning to clean since February, the house that had been mine on paper from the beginning and was now mine in every other way too. I thought about whether I wanted to stay. I sat with that question for a long time, the engine off the street quiet around me. I thought about the widow in my first-year seminar. I thought about my mother and the windows that stuck. I thought about a 26-year-old woman writing 3 words in the margin of her notes, never again. Ever, and meaning them with her whole future self. I thought about 11 years of real life in that house. The arguments in the driveway and the repainting of walls and the gardenias that came back every spring. The things that had been genuinely good. The things I was genuinely grieving, underneath the competence, underneath the preparation, in the place where the real feelings lived. I thought about all of it. Then I picked up my phone and called a real estate agent named Patricia, who I had worked with professionally for 7 years and trusted completely. She answered on the 3rd ring. I said, "Patricia, I have a 4-bedroom Craftsman in Buckhead. I want to list it." She said, "When?" I said, "As soon as the paperwork is ready." She said, "Scarlett, that property is going to move fast. That neighborhood, that square footage, the condition you keep it in." I said, "I know." She said, "What are you looking for next?" I looked out the windshield at the Newburyport blue front door. I said, "Something that's only ever had one name on the deed." Patricia laughed, the genuine laugh of someone who found the answer exactly right. She said, "I'll start pulling listings tonight." I said, "Thank you, Patricia." I hung up, looked at the house one more time. Then I started the car and drove away from Andover Drive, through Buckhead, down Peachtree, into the city that was mine. In the same way it had always been mine, not because anyone had given it to me, but because I had built myself into it carefully, completely, with documentation for everything. The penthouse was on the 23rd floor of a building in Old 4th Ward, 8 blocks from Ponce City Market, with floor-to-ceiling windows on the south and east walls that made the entire city feel like something you could hold in your hands. Patricia had sent me the listing on a Wednesday evening with a single line of text, "This one. Call me." I had looked at the photos for approximately 4 minutes. Then I had called her. We toured it on a Thursday morning, 2,100 square feet open, plan a kitchen with a 12-foot island, and windows above the sink that faced east. A primary bedroom with a walk-in closet. I could fit a small car in a second bedroom. I was already thinking of as a library and a terrace off the living room that ran the full width of the unit, with a view of downtown Atlanta that on clear days stretched all the way to Stone Mountain. The previous owner had lived there for 6 years and maintained it with the reverent attention of someone who understood what they had. The floors were original white oak. The kitchen had been redone 2 years prior. The closets were cedar-lined. Patricia said, standing in the middle of the living room with the morning light coming through the east windows, "Well?" I stood at the terrace door and looked out at the city. I said, "What's the ask?" She told me. I said, "Counter at 2% below. Cash, 30-day close." She said, "Done." It was done in 26 days. The closing was on a Tuesday morning in late May in a conference room at a title company on Edgewood Avenue. The seller's attorney was there, and Patricia and the title officer, and Marcus, who had driven across town in morning traffic because he had been at every significant closing of my professional life and was not going to miss this one. The documents were prepared and reviewed and ready. The title officer passed the signature packet across the table. I picked up the pen. The deed read in the careful, plain language of legal instruments, "Grantee Scarlett Marie Hendricks, an unmarried woman, as her sole and separate property." I read my own name. I had read my own name on deeds before 5 times, in fact, across 11 years of careful accumulation. But this one was different. Not because of the square footage or the floor or the view from the terrace. Because of the words that followed the name, "an unmarried woman as her sole and separate property." Not a technicality this time. Not something I'd revisit later. Just the truth, stated cleanly, with nothing complicated underneath it. I signed my name, set the pen down, looked at Marcus. He was looking at me over his glasses with the expression he had worn at the end of our first meeting 11 years ago, when I had walked in at 29 with a file folder and a clarity of purpose that had apparently made an impression. He said, "Congratulations, Scarlett." I said, "Thank you, Marcus, for all of it." He said, 11 years. I've been saying the same thing for 11 years. You always know the number before you walk in the room." I said, "My mother." He said, "Smart woman." I said, "The smartest." I moved in on the first Saturday of June. I did not hire movers for the personal things. I wanted to carry them myself, the boxes of books, and the kitchen things, and the framed photographs, and the small objects that had accumulated over a life and meant something. I borrowed Denise's SUV and made 4 trips between a storage unit in Midtown, where I'd been keeping things, and the building on North Avenue with the white oak floors. My mother drove up from Savannah on Friday night and stayed through Sunday. She was 64 years old, and she had the same quality. She had always had a stillness that was not passivity, but its opposite. The stillness of a woman who has decided what matters and moves through the world accordingly. She stood at the terrace door on Saturday morning with a cup of coffee and looked out at Atlanta for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have said something dramatic about this view." I said, "What would she have said?" She said, "Child, you climbed all the way up here." I laughed. Real laughter, the deep, unguarded kind that comes from a specific place, from history and recognition and love. She looked at me. She said, "How do you feel?" I thought about the question the same way I had thought about it the morning Derek moved out honestly without performance, reaching for the accurate thing rather than the expected thing. I said, "Like myself." She nodded. She said, "Good. That's the only feeling that matters." We unpacked boxes all day Saturday. My mother organized the kitchen with the focused authority of a woman who has been organizing kitchens her entire life and knows exactly where things should go. She found the all-clad sauté pan and held it up. She said, "This is a good pan." I said, "I know." She said, "Your grandmother had a cast iron she kept for 40 years. I said, "I know that too." She set the pan on the stove, looked at it. She said, "A woman's kitchen should have at least 1 pan she doesn't share." I said, "I have 4. She looked at me. I said, "I kept all of them." She laughed. The same laugh I had, deep and unguarded, from the same specific place. On Sunday morning, I made breakfast. Eggs with good olive oil and sea salt toast from a sourdough loaf I had picked up at a farmer's market on Saturday, coffee in the French press I had owned since law school. We ate at the kitchen island with the east windows open and the city moving below us, and the morning light coming in at the angle that I had already begun to think of as mine. After breakfast, my mother sat at the island with her second cup of coffee and looked around the apartment at the white oak floors and the cedar closets and the city through the windows and the books beginning to fill the shelves in what was becoming the library, and she was quiet for a while, with the particular quality of quiet that meant she was thinking something she would say when she was ready. Then she said, "The woman who controls the paper controls the room." I said, "I know, Mama." She said, "I want you to know why I told you that." I said, "Tell me." She set her coffee down. She said, "When I was 22, your father's name was on everything we had. The apartment, the car, the account. I trusted him. I didn't think I needed to know. And when he left, I had $43 and a baby and a name that wasn't on a single piece of paper in the world." She paused. I swore I would never raise a daughter who didn't know her own name on a deed. I looked at her. I said, "You didn't." She said, "No, I didn't." She picked up her coffee. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it always did on Sunday mornings, slow and golden, the city breathing in a different rhythm than the rest of the week, the streets quieter, the light longer. She left at 2 p.m. I walked her to her car in the parking garage, and she held me for a moment, the way mothers hold you when they are proud and won't fully say it, arms tight, chin at your shoulder, the particular warmth of someone who has been on your side since before you understood what sides were. She said, "Call me when you're in." I said, "I'm already in." She said, "Call me anyway." I went back upstairs, stood at the terrace door. The city was spread out below me the way it always was, indifferent and continuous and full of people building things and losing things and starting over and carrying on. I had lived in Atlanta for 13 years. I had walked its streets and worked in its buildings and bought and sold pieces of it and watched it change and stayed constant in the things that mattered. I thought about the deed on the conference table that morning. Scarlett Marie Hendricks, an unmarried woman, as her sole and separate property. I thought about the widow in the seminar room and the 3 words in the margin of my notes. I thought about my mother at 22 with $43 and no paper with her name on it. I thought about the gardenias on Andover Drive that came back every spring without being asked to. I thought about the document, the one document, the deed, the post-nuptial agreement, the conversion clause, the promissory note, the accumulated paper of a life built carefully and with full attention. Not a trap, not a scheme. Just a woman who had learned early and learned completely that the world runs on paper, and that your name on the paper is the only thing that cannot be taken from you without your consent. I had never stopped believing that. I stood on my terrace on the 23rd floor of my building in Old 4th Ward, Atlanta, Georgia, and I looked at the city, and I felt fully and without complication, for the first time in a long time, like the ground was solid under my feet. It was. It had always been. I had just made sure of it. Know your paper before you need it. Not as a weapon, not as a wall, but as a foundation, the thing you build everything else on top of, the thing that remains when everything else shifts. The women who taught me this didn't teach it from bitterness. They taught it from love, from hard experience, from $43 and windows that stuck. And a seminar room in Atlanta where a young woman learned that a name on a deed is not a formality. It is a statement of fact. And the most powerful thing a woman can do is know completely what facts she is standing on. If this story stayed with you, if something in it sounded like something you've been thinking about, leave a comment below. Tell me what you're building. Tell me whose voice taught you to know your paper. I'll be reading.